I want to take a few minutes to talk about sort of the challenges and nature of Hebrew poetry. Israel used Hebrew poetry for a number of different contexts. They would use it for prophetic context. All of our prophets wrote in poetry. Worship context, like in the case of the Psalms. Teaching, like in Proverbs. Oratory, oracles, dirge. I mean, a lot of different contexts in which people would use poetry. It's sometimes an inset for narrative, but it's never used as narrative. That part to me has always been fascinating about ancient Israel. The rest of the ancient Near East would use poetry to tell stories. The Gilgamesh epic, Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, all these other big epic poems that tell some history or some story of the nation. But where the rest of the Near East uses poetry, Israel never does. As close as they come there's really three Psalms that sort of have a historical quality. Psalm 78, 105, and 106 might come close to that. But for the most part, Israel doesn't ever do that. And it's funny because so often Israel reflects the kind of storytelling and thinking that you see in the rest of the Near East. But that's an area in which they're very, very different. We do have some challenges as we try to read poetry. The actual sound of the poetry remains a mystery. Some of the distinctions that we've had among the consonants have disappeared over the years or been blurred over the years. We don't know where the original accents might have fallen. The original vowel system and syllabification, a little bit unsure about that, what that might have been. Some of the vocabulary is still problematic, or we don't know what words meant then that might mean a little something different now, or what context, what association they would have made with them then. And on top of all of those very practical linguistic problems, poetry itself comes with its own stylistic difficulties. You know, interpreting poems in your own language can sometimes be a challenge. Imagine now adding the difficulty of language and time and culture. Hebrew poetry is a little different. When we think about English poetry, we often think about rhyme and meter. But since Hebrew is an inflected language, rhyming is not that difficult. So Hebrew does what I always like to call rhyme the meaning. Instead of trying to rhyme the sound, matching lines will say something similar as part of a verse. This is one of the reasons I think the Bible seems to repeat itself a lot. That feature of rhyming the meanings of the verses is known as parallelism. And there are several different kinds of parallelism. I want to talk about probably the three most common. The first is synonymous parallelism. This is when the second line is very closely related to the thought of the first line to try and enhance a point. A good example of that would be something like Psalm 8:4. What are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Another kind of parallelism is an antithetic parallelism. This is where the second line contrasts the first line. This is very handy if you're ever doing wicked and righteous conversations. So Psalm 1:6 is a good example of an antithetic parallelism. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Or Psalm 37:9, the wicked shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. So there's an example of where the first line says something, the second line offers a contrasting thought to that first line. The third is sometimes a little more difficult to see. It's sometimes called a synthetic parallelism or a stair-step parallelism. This is when the second line further develops the thought. Sometimes the first line doesn't even develop a complete thought, or it takes it a little bit further. A good example would be something like Proverbs 25:18. Like a club, sword, or sharp arrow is the one who bears false witness against a neighbor. So there you have a parallelism where the second line and the first line neither expresses a complete thought, but they are sort of presented in parallel. The fun thing about this is very often our Hebrew authors are incredibly talented and they would start using these parallelisms in sequence. So a good example of this is something like Psalm 68:6. God gives the desolate a home to live in. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious live in a parched land. So if you notice, you have a synonymous parallelism at the top, the first two lines. God gives the desolate a home to live in. He leads prisoners to prosperity. So those two are saying basically the same thing. But then you have an antithetic parallelism if you pivot on that last line. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious live in a parched land. So they start playing with the structure. And this is a very common thing. The authors were very, very gifted, and I think it's time to take a moment to celebrate their artistic gifts as well. Another feature you'll find in Hebrew poetry is a chiasmus. A chiastic pattern is when you reverse the order of elements between lines. So if you have A, B, C, then you go C, B, A. Really good example of this in Isaiah chapter 6. Make the heart of this people fat, make their ears heavy, shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. So you see you have the parallel for ears and ears and eyes, and heart and heart, and that, A, B, C, C, B, A, as it goes through the story. Nice chiasm. Closely related to a chiasm, a little bit different, is something known as an inclusio. An inclusio is just when a beginning and ending of a psalm are exactly the same, or sometimes a psalm group will do this. Psalm 8 verse 1 and Psalm 8 verse 9 are, O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Psalm 1:1 begins with the word ashrei, or happy, and Psalm 2:11 ends with the word ashrei. The last verse of Psalm 2 begins with ashrei, so you get that inclusio there between Psalm 1 and 2. Some have suggested that you read Psalm 1 and 2 as a unit, and that's demonstrating that feature. One of the most difficult, I imagine, to write features of Hebrew poetry is the acrostic. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and an acrostic psalm is one where lines or groups of lines each begin with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So Psalm 25, Psalm 34, Psalm 111, Psalm 112, Psalm 119 is perhaps the most famous grouping of that, as it has 8 lines all beginning with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So 8 lines all starting with Aleph, 8 lines all starting with Beit, 8 lines all starting with Gimel, all the way through. It's why it's such a long psalm. Why would you do this? Probably it does aid in memorization as you're trying to remember. There was an oral history behind all of these texts, so that could be part of it. It's also possible that you may just want to show off. Maybe just want to show off some talent. That would be incredible. I mean, take a moment to think about how hard it would be to write a song that would naturally start where every line started with the successive letter of the alphabet, and do it in such a way that it comes naturally, that it doesn't seem forced, where you're not, xylophone music. I mean, you actually are using normal, everyday conversational words that actually make this happen. It's really kind of a neat thing. So those are some elements of Hebrew poetry I wanted you to be aware of as you look at the text, and have some appreciation for the art that's going on there.